Это я, комиссар Binkov.
It is I, Commissar Binkov. Welcome to Russia versus United States Global Nuclear Showdown. As you might imagine, this time the nukes are allowed. Actually, this time only nukes will fly. So how would a fairly sudden nuclear exchange between these two superpowers go? Scenario will assume only weeks of tension buildup and preparation before first missile launches. In order to actually detect an intercontinental ballistic missile, one has to have an early warning network. Usually, earliest warning comes from satellites looking for hot exhaust of large missiles going high into orbit. US has more such satellites, making early detection more likely. Spies could also warn of mass missile launches, as missile silo locations are known and launches from them are hard to hide. Finally, huge specialized early warning radars could track the incoming missiles and their warheads and provide some 15 minutes or more of additional warning before first impact. Typical path of an intercontinental ballistic missile means Earth's curvature would hide it from the radars until the last part of its flight. While silo-based missiles have predictable approach vectors, truck-based launchers can offer somewhat more surprising approaches. Submarine-launched missiles offer possibly the most surprise, though one does need to survive and travel the ocean for such attempts. But perhaps a safer way of submarine usage is simply staying hidden fairly close to the North Pole, which too would shave minutes off travel time and thus also warning time. Is there a defense against ICBMs? On paper, to a degree, yes. For decades, some limited anti-ballistic systems were deployed by both sides, but they were never numerous. Even today, they are more a defense against limited strikes from smaller countries than against a large-scale nuclear exchange. There are additional systems which could in theory also intercept, but being generally designed against lower velocity targets, they are unlikely to be successful in meaningful numbers. Even to try, their launch platforms would need to be perfectly positioned in advance. None of those systems could catch a missile before it separates its warheads, and due to low probability of intercept and small number of deployed interceptors, only a fraction of warheads could be intercepted. But ballistic missiles aren't only means of nuclear strike. While they are by far the quickest, they would be accompanied by cruise missile strikes and even possibly airplane bomb runs. Important to note, only a small portion of bombers could in reality be kept ready for patrol and a quick mission. By the time first such wave launches their weapons, their home bases would most likely be evaporated. Furthermore, intercepting bombers and cruise missiles may be easier than intercepting ICBMs, leading to even fewer successful strikes. So cruise missiles and bombs would in reality add little to total destruction. The main strike would of course come via ICBM and submarine-launched missiles. US has a bit more missiles and their missiles can on average carry more warheads. Currently, however, US missiles deploy less warheads than their potential, as prepared warheads cost additional money. Russians, on the other hand, seem to be deploying missiles close to their total warhead capacity. In case of a potential war, additional warheads could be deployed if missile design and time permits. Important to note is that while almost all ground-based missiles could be expected to be ready and restocked with warheads within weeks, submarines are subject to lengthy maintenance and preparation for deployment periods. Realistically, no more than a third of total submarine force could be expected to be deployed on patrol in a matter of weeks. However, just as during the Cold War, additional subs could be alerted enough to fire their missiles from the ports. Overall, up to two-thirds of submarines could be expected to fire their missiles. And part of the US deployed subs would be on patrol from before, with lower number of warheads. US could also deliver a bit more warheads via their bombers, as they are more numerous and they can carry more warheads per plane. Total stockpiles of nuclear warheads of both countries are a few times larger. But with just weeks to prepare as scenario suggests, most of them could simply not be put to use in time. Also, the figures given include tactical nuclear weapons, of which Russia has many more than US, due to its different doctrine where it keeps nukes in case of a European land war. A nuclear exchange where one side suddenly launches first would benefit the side with better early warning capabilities and more launch platforms. But this scenario won't consider such one-sided launch. Also possible would be a scenario where there is little to no preparation time, just days. In that case, Russia might benefit more, as it already has its warhead count maxed out on its active missiles. Such sudden one-sided launch could thus hurt the enemy much more, but realistically, no one wants to commence such an unprovoked attack. A more plausible nuclear exchange, as featured in this scenario, would be a consequence of a series of misunderstandings and accidents leading to all-out nuclear war. Early warning radars, submarine communication arrays, and command centers would be targeted first, as well as silo-based launchers of the opposing side, hoping to destroy at least some of them before they launch. Hardest to find and destroy would be submarines fairly close to home shores. But they too are somewhat limited in capability compared to huge silo-based missiles. Various military bases would also be targeted, so further bomber strikes past the initial wave are unlikely. A tiny portion of missiles launched might be expected to malfunction, and a few might get intercepted. Bombers and their cruise missiles would get intercepted in greater numbers. For some decades now, doctrine of both sides maintains that smaller yield warheads are better, as more of them can be crammed inside missiles. So what else would be targeted? Anything that would severely disrupt the other side's military and economic potential. Cities too would be targeted in numbers, but after a certain point it makes more sense to spend a warhead on a factory, a large harbor or a power plant than on a small town. This scenario will thus model most warheads striking military targets, some going after major industrial targets and a little over a third of warheads going straight for biggest population centers. Military and industrial targets, though, are often close to various towns, adding to civilian casualties. What sort of effects does a nuclear explosion have? If detonation happens lower, near the ground, there will be much more nuclear fallout, as the radiated particles enter the soil and that soil is thrown into the air. But the ground and the buildings will provide a shield, so other effects may be much less lethal at distance. Detonations high up in the air will kill more people instantly, but there will be much less radiated soil thrown around and much less danger from long-term radiation risk. Concrete-made structures are also less likely to be destroyed at a distance. The explosion creates a fireball that is fairly small compared to the reach of other effects. The air pressure blast crushes the buildings. There is also direct radiation emitted. It lasts only for a moment, but it can be deadly when one is near the blast. Finally, there is heat or thermal radiation. If directly exposed to its rays, it can be deadly even at some distance. A very important issue here is one of shielding and absorption. All the figures were given for effects on a single unshielded target at given distance, but just standing behind a structure can greatly shield a person from said threats. Basically, if the building doesn't collapse, a brick house will shield a person from most of the radiation and direct heat rays, even if it's much closer than said distances. Studies have shown that casualties inside dwellings are around 90% lower than when people are simply standing out in the open. So how deadly would a detonation over center of New York be, for example? Basically, even if inside the building, anyone under 2 kilometers from the projected epicenter of explosion would likely be killed. 450 kiloton blast is usually modeled to kill some 1.2 million people. Assumption is that people are standing out in the open. Going inside a building or underground would certainly help a lot, as there would be enough warning time for a large portion of population to hide away. Of course, getting out of the heaps of rubble alive is a different matter. Projected direct casualties are thus going to be modeled after a similar study, lower than ones when no shielding is involved, depending on the rurality of the target and availability of underground areas. As the map shows, one would need a dozen or more warheads to achieve high lethality over a majority of the most densely populated New York City area. Moscow, on the other hand, is a bit more populous, although also spread over a larger area. It would take several more nukes to cover it in a similar fashion. US on the whole has less cities with over 1 million residents, but US has more medium-sized cities of less than 500,000 people. Average population density of Russian cities is a bit bigger than US, due to greater use of condominiums. US households are more often found in standalone houses. At close distances though, US houses can more easily be brought down by explosion effects and ensuing firestorms. Overall population density of two countries favors US slightly. That is because a vast portion of Russia is basically uninhabited. All of that means that US, with more warheads available and successfully delivered, could destroy roughly 30% more cities in Russia than Russia could destroy US ones. But Russian efficiency would be compensated by the fact US has more mid-sized cities, so Russian warheads could be more efficiently used on them. Both sides, with US more than Russia, would find themselves in a lack of large enough cities to justify spending a warhead on them. As said, at a certain city size threshold, such a warhead would likely rather be spent on a military or industrial target. US here holds some advantage, as Russian military is smaller, and overall number of military targets might require a smaller proportion of warheads spent on it. Thus more US warheads might be available against economic targets or cities. Total human casualties stemming from the blasts and their direct consequences such as injuries, firestorms, or collapsed buildings are likely to total tens of millions. Not all of those casualties would be instantaneous, as people would die from injuries over the course of a few days. Medical attention would not be available for most. Fallout or radioactive particles that might subsequently enter the body in days and months after the war would kill millions more. If modeled after Hiroshima bombing, 20% more might die within months due to radiation sickness. Cancers and other long-term health issues would also appear, though their significance is quite a bit smaller. Millions more might die over the next several years. Much more deadly would be the indirect consequences. Disease spread would claim millions more, but sudden disappearance of a modern state and its infrastructure would mean tens of millions might lack regular food intake and shelter. Fighting would break out as there would be no proper organized law enforcement. Tens of millions might die in the coming year or so. Finally, the effects of nuclear winter can't be omitted. With all the dust being thrown in the atmosphere by explosion and firestorms, the world's climate would cool down a bit, and thus change. That would bring problems with crops and livestock. But exact range of effects is impossible to predict, as many studies over the decades have proposed widely different results. Important to note, nuclear winter would affect the world as a whole, not just the two belligerents. 100 million or 1 billion people might die from starvation across the world, but there is simply no way to settle on a more exact figure. It is likely that Russia and US would cease to exist as nations we know today, as governments might crumble and geopolitical map might be redrawn after a new world order arises, with certain third-party countries profiting from the war, which only really makes such a bilateral nuclear war less likely. There would be no real winner, only a side that lost a bit less. In the end, the only winning move would be not going to war in the first place. As usual, feel free to subscribe, and if you really like my videos, you can support me via the above link through the Patreon crowdfunding website. And if you'd like to see a specific pair to be made into a video, hop over to my website using the link above, and there you can submit pairs you'd like to see as well as vote in my monthly poll, deciding which videos will be made. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.